In the Trenches with Ryan Roxie.
You came from Iowa. You're born in Iowa, and you came up from rather poor conditions, and you've been able to really succeed, almost the American dream, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very lucky. I was the oldest of six kids. My father was an alcoholic who is a very violent man, and so I spent the better part of my upbringing trying to protect my brothers and sisters from him and my mother. Yeah, we had poor conditions, but I was the luckiest guy in the world because I had so many people over the course of my lifetime who've invested in me. Sometimes I look at them and wonder why. They put a lot out there for me. So, I think that old line, too much has been given, much is expected. And so, from my perspective, I owe much more than I ever had to pay. And I feel very lucky to be here. I'm great to be with you. You're an incredibly important voice to a really important audience. And so, this is one of those examples where, I'm in your debt to be here with you today, not the other way around.
That's the thing I'm always reminded of when I listen to your podcast, and I'm just talking to you now, is that, and you say it a lot, the word humility. You have a lot of humility. You're the first person to admit that you don't know it all, and you wish you did. And for some reason, this pandemic, you're saying, is confusing you more now than it might have 6 months ago.
Yeah, I there are two things that happen to me every morning when I get up. The first thing is I wake up and I hear this old 1960s Fifth Dimension tune in my head playing. Do you remember the old dawning of the age of Aquarius?
Of
Except this
course.
one's playing. This is the dawning of the age of the variants. When the new variants developed and came out and it became front and center, we realized it was fundamentally changing a number of the issues related to the pandemic and how this virus was spread and what it means. The second thing that happens, I look over to my nightstand and I look at my crystal ball there and I realize somehow overnight 5 inches of caked mud have accumulated on that crystal ball. So every morning I have to scrape the damn mud off just so I can even start to go. And some days I'm not sure how well I do that. So, I start each day like that. So in fact, for your audience's sake, as you've heard me say in my podcast, I think I knew more about the virus 6 months ago than I do today. And so I think all we can do is just be honest and share what we know, what we don't know, and realize that we're today part of what I call evolving science, where we study, we learn, we implement, then we study again, we learn and we implement, and we're basically building this plane at 30,000 feet while it's flying. And we just have to make sure that the public understands what we know, what we don't know, and what we don't know, how we're trying to find out what we should know.
Well, we're going to talk a lot about the actual COVID virus in a little bit, but I want to go back with your fascination with viruses back when Dawning of the Age of Aquarius was a song on I think it was the Hair soundtrack. Am I right with that?
I think, yeah, I think so. There you go, right there. That's it. Thank you.
How did you get that so quick, Vic?
Yeah.
He's quick, our producer. You know what? After 100 episodes, he's even quicker than before.
Yeah.
But the thing is, this is back in the 60s, late 60s. What got you into studying infectious diseases?
Well, I had this is a part of that story I said where I owe a lot. At the small town Iowa newspaper where my father worked, the owners were really truly Renaissance individuals, particularly the wife of the editor, who I think she was the only person in the state of Iowa back in the 1960s that subscribed to the New Yorker magazine. And one day when I was in junior high, she shared with me an article from there out of what was called the Annals of Medicine. A guy by the name of Burton Roget wrote these. And they were whodunit stories, kind of medical detective stories, largely at that time, the Communicable Disease Center, as was called back then, outbreaks that would occur and how, people solved them. And I loved these. It was kind of a cross between Sherlock Holmes and modern medicine. And so every time that a New Yorker would arrive, she would call me when they were done, and I would run the 6 blocks to her house. Couldn't wait to get it, and I loved reading it. And so I even knew in high school I wanted to be a medical detective. And so my whole education process was really oriented to that. And I owe her everything for having gotten my interest in this area. And I just have to say one last thing, that one of the most special moments of my life was the fact that years later, when I was a state epidemiologist in charge of all infectious diseases for the state of Minnesota, we had a large outbreak in the state that ultimately ended up being written up as Burton Roget's very last annals of medicine before he died. And I had the opportunity some 20 years later to be able to share with him a sense of gratitude because, I laid it out there and said, frankly,
He
had it
was the
not
one
been
that
for you, I
inspired you.
wouldn't be here. And it was one
Wow.
of the most rewarding moments of my career to be able to look and he was obviously very gracious and wonderful about that, but it was one of my ways of just being able to come back. I mean, it's like you. I mean, if you could go back to when you were a young boy into a teenage years, is there somebody in your life that has such a big impact that you never had the chance to tell them, but now today you could?
Well,
Do it.
and
Do it.
like you, I've been able to have a lot of those opportunities to meet a lot of those posters on
Yeah.
my wall. For instance, we just wrapped up a tour with the band Kiss, or
Yeah.
not the band Kiss, but Ace Frehley from Kiss, and Ace Frehley was one of my guitar heroes. So night after night,
Isn't that great?
he would come up on stage with us and play Schools Out. So yeah, I know exactly what you're saying about
Yeah.
your heroes. So it's cool to think that, I had guitar heroes, you had science heroes.
Yep, I did.
And it eventually led you into Minnesota, where you are today, and that's the area where you do most of your work. I know that the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, I see the acronym for it is CIDRAP.
Yep.
CIDRAP, and I know that that's we're going to show the podcast thumbnail right now, so you can understand where that's from. But that's the podcast that Mike does, and it feels weird just saying Mike because I know you as
Please do.
Dr. Michael Osterholm, but that's the one that Mike does every single week. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But then you were initially doing a lot of studies on straight up influenza. Am I correct?
Right. I have spent the last 45 years of my life literally dealing with influenza. And the fact that if you go back for the last 250 years, there have been 11 global pandemics of respiratory agent virus. And almost certainly all these were influenza. We have no evidence that one like a coronavirus appeared. And so I'd studied a lot about that. And in fact, in 2017, along with my co-author, Mark Olshaker, wrote a book called Deadliest Enemies, Our War Against Killer Germs, in which we go into some detail about why we're so unprepared for another global pandemic of influenza. Well, it wasn't influenza, it was a coronavirus that showed up this time. And even there, we were concerned about it. Chapter 13, ironically, of that book is entitled SARS and MERS, a harbinger of things to come. SARS and MERS were coronaviruses that appeared in 2003 and 2012, but never did result in full worldwide pandemics. So, I could, tell that this was going to be an event one day that we were so ill prepared for, and tried to lay out plans for what we might do. But then, of course, when it finally hit, um, we wanted to, first of all, deny that it was happening. Second of all, once we recognized it, our responses have been fragmented. As you
Right.
so appropriately said, they're really politicized, and this has been really tragic.
Well, unfortunately, like you said, we're building a plane that's in midair right now and it's trying to fly. And the only thing that we really have to go by as far as an airborne type of pandemic type of thing is influenza. So does all that experience that you have studying, learning about influenza, has that prepared you? Has that given you a lot of more, or are you always, mystified by this corona
Well, I
virus?
think that, unfortunately, it did give us a sense initially of what was happening. For example, back on March 10th of 2020, I was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and at that time, the number of deaths in the United States could be counted in two digits, and people still were of the mind that this was not going to really be anything. It was soon to be under control. And
Yeah.
I said at that time on the podcast, to the anger of many, that this was going to last at least 18 months and it was likely at least 480,000 people would die. Well, I was wrong about the 480,000. Actually, 600,000 people died in those first 18 months. And so I had a sense that the implications would be huge. We knew, I have a whole section in my book talking about supply chains and how a global pandemic today was going to bring down much of our international trade and manufacturing, shipment, et cetera, which now we're experiencing exactly that. So a lot of those things we could anticipate. But what we couldn't have anticipated is how this virus is acting that's different than a flu virus. If you look at those pandemics that we talked about, the 11 of them during the 250 years, what happened is they would show up at any season. In fact, the 11 were distributed through all four seasons when they first showed up, not just in the winter. And what was very interesting about them is that they would have an initial wave and then a second wave, and in some cases a third wave. But within 2 years, they just basically settled into being part of the seasonal flu picture, so that you could expect to see in the northern hemisphere winter or the southern hemisphere winter, it would just show up. This coronavirus isn't doing that. This one is continuing to burn wherever there's human wood to burn. And this is a real challenge. And we're realizing that, as much as the vaccines are really remarkable tools, and they're very, very important, they're not perfect. And
Not
we'll
perfect.
talk more about that. But the other point to make is that early on, we had this sense that if you got 70 or 80% of the population protected, it'd be enough to slow everything down. You couldn't keep having big surges. Well, look what's happening as we speak right now. Look
In
at
Europe,
Look at
where
Europe.
I'm actually recording right now. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, here we're talking about countries that have over 80% of their population vaccinated, and they're still seeing the terrible, terrible challenges. As you see, Austria today just went in total lockdown, etc. Even here in the United States, we're seeing major surges. I happen to sit right now in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where this past week we've had the highest incidence of cases in the whole country. And on top of it, if we were a country ourselves in Minnesota this week, we would have been the number 10th country in the world for this kind of COVID situation. So it's a challenge right now that we didn't see with influenza. This one's going to go on for some time.
I'm Ryan Roxie, and I've taken all my years of experience of playing guitar, and I want to pass the torch of rock and roll on to you. Check out the System 12 Guitar Method.